Good afternoon for those who are in our time zone here and those who are in presence in the room, and good morning, good evening to the many people who are joining us online. Welcome to everybody. It's my pleasure to moderate this event today. My name's Nadia Wells. I work at the Global Health Centre here at the Graduate Institute, and I work on global health financing. And it's my pleasure to introduce two of my colleagues who will be enlightening us on Trump's 100 days in the context of gender and global health. So firstly, I'll just give a couple of informations about how we're going to run the conference today. So we will be hearing from each of our speakers for about 15 minutes, which will take up the first half of the hour that we're going to spend together. And then the second half, we very much welcome your questions, both from people in the room and from people online. And I'll be moderating the question taking afterwards. So please, when we get to questions, I will repeat this again. Please identify yourself and please ask a question. We often have people who come and give long discourses. It's not so constructive when we've got these two wonderful people to talk to. Please come and ask a question in the Q&A. So thank you very much. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Professor Somerville. Claire is the Executive Director of the Gender Centre here at the Institute. She's an anthropologist who did her PhD at Cambridge in the UK. And her work focuses on gender and global health across many of the therapeutic areas so important to our global health today. Her work particularly bridges policy and practice, and is informed, that policy and practice work is informed by her academic research, which recently has focused particularly on digital gender gaps, and a big focus on applied research in recent years, so that the findings of research can be brought into the real world of policy making. Claire, I welcome you to the podium. And then secondly, I'll introduce Professor Nguyen, who is the co-director of the Global Health Centre here at the Institute. He's a physician whose clinical practice has moved around the world, having qualified in Canada and also taken his PhD in medical anthropology in public health and trained as a medical anthropologist in Canada. He's worked in clinical practice, starting really in the emergence of the epidemic in Canada of HIV, and then subsequently has worked across many clinical contexts, particularly in conflict zones. He works today across from the Canadian Arctic with indigenous populations. He's worked in cholera epidemics in Yemen and in Ebola several times in West Africa, also working with Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, over many years. His research work in recent years has focused very much on antimicrobial resistance in conflict, and also on financialization of pharmaceuticals. Vinh-Kim, please will you join us?
Great, thank you very much for the introduction. I want to begin by just laying out a few reasons why gender and global health even matters. For a couple of decades, quite a lot of us have been working to assemble an evidence base to convince ministries of health, to convince funders and journals even, that there are in fact gendered dimensions to health, and that global health is gendered in and of itself. And this was something of an uphill battle, not least because, of course, health sciences, biomedical sciences, depart from the physiological body. And that leads us, of course, to think about biologies and the question of sex, which has sometimes been problematic in thinking about gender. But we have now reached the point, and I'm glad to have been part of that process, where an intersectional analysis of gender provides really strong correlations between disease outcomes, disease experiences in terms of access to health, and even morbidity and mortality. And we now have incontrovertible evidence that we know a gender analysis improves our health research, it makes it more scientific, and it advances health for all. So it's against this public health standpoint that I really want to think about the question we have here and what's been happening the first few months of the new administration. I think it's really important to point out at this stage that the work we've all done so far in trying to do analyse the gender dimensions of health has been about collecting data and doing analysis, but that's actually turned out to be a very political journey. And as we know, global health is hugely political and gender is political. We put the two together and we have quite a challenge when we are faced with what we're now describing as something of a backlash. I think it's rather more than a backlash, actually. I think there's something, I'm going to make the argument, that is more fundamental that is happening. So, as Nadia said, I've been looking at this field and following negotiations in Geneva, not just in global health, but across the other multilateral fora for more than a decade now, and observing some of the contours of the gender politics that unfold. And again, this is with this reflection I want to speak. So why, on day one of Trump's inauguration, in fact, in his inauguration speech, did he feature gender so highly? He said in his inauguration speech, "As of today, it will henceforth be the official policy of the United States government that there are only two genders, male and female." Probably what's most interesting about this statement, I thought at the time, was that Trump actually used the word gender. And that is because later in the day, he signed 2 executive orders that requested this word were no longer used by federal employees. And in fact, to quote, "All federal employees should use the term sex and not gender in all federal policies and documents." So these are kind of speech acts and silences and attempts to eliminate language, which not only eliminate and erase language, but erase entire gender minorities and groups. And majorities. In fact, it pretty much attempts at erasing a lot. And it rests really on a dystopian hope that if it is unnamed, it doesn't exist. So since then, Trump has signed nearly 150 executive orders, many of which impact gender and some also impact global health. But we actually only have to look at the afternoon of the 20th of January to understand the gravity of the ideology that drives the administration's fixation on gender. So there were 2 executive orders that afternoon worthy of mentioning in their full titles. The first is Executive Order 14168. The name, Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. Executive Order 14151, Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programmes and Preferencing. So this has been followed by numerous other executive orders over the last month or so that incorporate all sorts of things from keeping men out of women's sports to ending equity ideology in schooling. But we'll just stick to the 20th of January for now. So what does this mean, defending women from gender ideology? It's really an executive order that gives, in fact, of all the executive orders that's come out, it's the one that's rather detailed. It gives a series of definitions, it gives a series of examples of documents that should be rescinded, including the White House gender policy, and it has a stab at defining biological sex. So it does a lot of things in one document. Probably most important for this discussion is that it sees a biological sex as immutable and not changeable in any way. It will not allow gender identity to be seen as sex. And I think the important thing is that there's no possibility of anything changing. So the logic here, like the logic is that any other definitions of womanhood, and women is what they are claiming to define here, that might use gender, constitute a threat that, I quote, fundamentally attack women by depriving them of their dignity, safety, and well-being. So the order, it claims, is out there to protect women, which is a fairly typical patriarchal sentiment. The preamble to the executive order is the bit that's most invested with emotional politics and presents gender ideologues as an entity as those that undermine the cherished legal rights and invalidate the category of women. So the executive order sets up a kind of enemy within. Those that promote gender ideology, they're seen as infiltrating society, and thus they clearly, and I quote again, all funding to anything deemed to be gender ideology must end. And as I said, they make a curious stab at trying to define what biological sex is, which somewhat transcends most understandings of the sex characteristics, but it bases itself at a cellular level to be produced at the moment of conception. So again, following the logic of the moment of conception being the point where life happens, so does apparently sex, which of course is invisible at that point in time. And it's worth saying that sex in itself is highly contested. That we see from the Supreme Court judgment last week, in fact, in the UK, that it is contested and the new definitions have been proposed. We see it in elite sports, we see it at the International Olympic Committee. So that in itself is not new. But this rewriting of sex, biological sex, codifies the erasure of many people, intersex, trans, and the many millions of non-binary people around the world. And I think we really have to pause for a moment. This was the first executive order that was signed, and that's what it does. That's its immediate impact. I think the second impact is the implementation, the problem, and I think we all risk becoming complicit in this. The DEI order that came just after the first one on women cross-referenced to a fact sheet, which is still available on the White House website, where DEI is described as discriminatory. And there is a consequence when it says that agencies need to identify and take appropriate action regarding any foreign service officer who knowingly and willfully engages in illegal discrimination, which the order, of course, has just mentioned as DEI, gender and equity. So, along with the many documents it describes and it does, or order to be rescinded, we have a series of executive orders on day one of an administration, and I think we need to think carefully about why that happened on day one and what are the politics behind that. Where did this all come from? And I want to take a few moments just to sort of plot out the backstory to this, because it's clearly part of a larger political agenda, and it isn't necessarily even only about gender or even only about global health, but arguably about wider geopolitical inequalities. It's for sure there has been resistance to gender, the concept of gender going back to the 1990s. There was backlash and resistance at Beijing and a lot of negotiations on the concept of gender. So with the Rome Statute, and in fact the Rome Statute definition aligns rather closely with Trump's insistence on a sex binary. So, this was happening 30 years ago. Those in health will recall perhaps the contestations that happened in 2018 around the Astana Declaration for primary health care, which was a huge declaration replacing Alma Ata, where there were really heated discussions. And you'll note on page 5 of that declaration that still stands, there is a sovereignty clause by the US excluding it from full reproductive health and rights. So we've seen fierce contestation. We've seen it at the WHO. We've seen it at the Executive Board of the WHO. We saw it last year when 5 resolutions that included the term gender responsiveness were stalled. One eventually broke consensus and went to a vote. It passed, but consensus building is part and part of the package of global health as an entity. So, whilst resistances have been there, we've definitely seen an uptick in the political ideology that underpins them. And I think this is the really important point. And I'm just going to give one example of many that I could give of the ways in which this has been mobilised in a way that I believe to be different from previous contestations that have happened over gender. Those of us who work in gender are used to having resistances. We're used to being combative in some of the ways and the arguments, and we have to present and being articulate about them. But there is something peculiar about the ideology behind this at the moment. So I want to take you back to, very briefly, to 2020. And at that point, there is a declaration made, a document, just 2.5 pages long, called the Geneva Consensus Declaration. It is not, as the name sounds, a UN declaration. It's nothing to do with Geneva, and it wasn't even signed in Geneva. Although it really has the look and the feel of a UN multilateral document. And in fact, it was signed by 29 government officials, not always very high-ranking, but nevertheless representative. And it was Mike Pompeo who was behind the declaration, along with some other activists. And it's called Promoting Women's Health, Strengthening the Family. This really echoes the themes that link the work of global health actors with traditional family units and gender orders. And it's really curious to ask why it is that they mimicked so closely the UN processes, the UN engagement, and co-opted the words of consensus and, in fact, the International City of Geneva. And I think this is where we find the seeds of that political ideology that we're really now seeing play out in Trump's early executive orders. What was interesting about that document that still exists and has been Biden withdrew from it, Trump has re-signed it, is that it reflects a geopolitical alliance that tends to act in synchrony in bridging faith groups, political enemies, financial streams that really crisscross the world, and they reproduce and mimic the processes of the UN system that give their acts some kind of legitimacy by constant citation, particularly to the UN Declaration on Human Rights. Selecting texts out of the declaration, they recreate the Geneva Consensus Declaration. And in particular, the family, the role of the family as a fundamental unit of society, and a reference to binary women and men. This has been analysed in the last sort of 2 to 3 years or so, and in a way, we see this replaying through the executive orders that are coming out. It's not unknown, and it's been fairly well documented, that the idea of dismantling and using gender and global health as a means to dismantle elements of the UN system of multilateralism was outlined pretty clearly in Project 2025, which is a 900-page document with over 500 authors published by the Heritage Foundation. And in many ways, we were alerted to this. We talked about this back in 2023 when Kevin Roberts, in January of 2023, Kevin Roberts of the Heritage Foundation sat down at a public platform at Davos and denounced the WHO as a colonialist organisation spreading harmful gender ideology. So we see the two come together very, very closely. I mean, at least 2.5 years ago, there was some pre-thinking behind this. And I think clearly the politics here of health, quite often sexual reproductive health and rights, and linking global multilateral organisations together, at a time when those organisations were also trying to decolonise their knowledge base and their practices, really wove together one anti-UN, one anti-multilateral tapestry with a quite clear message. So in that sense, I think what is happening now is different and represents something of a particular short-term goal. Whether that's to dismantle the entire multilateral system, we hope not, but they really are, gender and health are both soft targets, they're really easy vehicles for this to be implemented, in part because the idea of restoring the family as such a fundamental unit of society fits into women's health and other narratives that have come out of those global institutions. So my main point would be that I would argue, at least in terms of gender, what is happening right now is different in character and political ideology. It's distinctive in that it plays out within the post-war system of multilateralism. And in many ways, this is the target, and gender and health are just simply the vehicles towards that goal. Trump's move on day one has certainly created, I think, executive disorder, and that's exactly what the feminist, African-American feminist Kimberly Crenshaw has been calling it in a series of podcasts of the same name. And I think taking the anthropological sense as well, that in that disorder we have a lot of theory going back in the history of anthropology examining disorder and order and the betwixt and between space of transformation. And in casting, I think, this disorder across the world in terms of gender and global health, particularly in other areas more generally, we are in that sort of liminal space of disorder. And I think actually, optimistically, having laid out the challenges we've already faced with those first executive orders, I think we could face a rather transformational moment, not just in global health, but rethinking and taking on board some of those criticisms, and we must take some of those critiques on board, of both the multilateral order, but also the knowledge bases that we have built, the architecture of global health, but also the theories and thinking around doing a gender analysis. So I'd like to take that further in the Q&A, but for now I think I'll hand over to Vinh-Kim, who'll talk more specifically, I believe, on health. Thanks.
So I'm going to try and be brief and concise. I think, so I want to talk about why global health and its impact. As Claire mentioned, I think it's important to underscore how what a soft target global health and gender were. No political capital or very little political capital needed to be spent, and it was just very, very easy to hit hard with minimal side effects. And I think in the first 100 days, Trump's first 100 days, of course, now we're talking about the economic, the geopolitical alliances, but I would agree with Claire to underscore the significance of gender and global health being the first targets. In fact, that list of executive orders is very, as Claire mentioned, is very illuminating because the first 6 are about basically revenge, weaponizing and rolling back Biden policies. Number 7 is the order that Claire mentioned on gender, which is initially seems more domestically focused, and the first international focused or directed order is the one on global health. So this is where it all begins. And if we are to understand these first 100 days, we have to understand why global health was on the top of the list. We don't really know, but I'm going to speculate here in terms of the kind of logics we've seen unfold over the next 100 days. So certainly, global health was clearly symbolic of something. It was an area where America could demonstrate strength through withdrawal. The fact that millions of people depended on the U.S. to stay alive made them an easy target to show the U.S. force. So it's weaponizing people's dependence on U.S. aid. That was what was done. So it was a very powerful symbolic demonstration of American power on the weakest and most vulnerable. So there's a symbolism to that, too. We've all read about how President Trump is characterized as a bully, and we all know that bullies prey on weak people, not on other strong people. So I see a certain resonance there. It was also the highest profile, as Claire mentioned, global health is the soft underbelly of multilateralism. It is its moral core. What do I mean by that? Countries come together to address problems that they share. Global health was the one area where it was felt this was not a space for competition. There was only a win-win. Only in global health could countries come together and collaborate. So by striking at this one area that seemed, a virtuous consensus, there was a kind of a signaling there of, or targeting of multilateralism, and that's why WHO came first. And finally, I think it's signaling, and this is linked to a way, it signals there's an ethos whereby the targeting of global health signals, if you will, what I call it's anti-virtue signaling. So instead of prancing around saying we save mothers and babies and children and we're moral and taking the high ground, the U.S. is actually doing the opposite by this. It's saying we don't care and we don't have to. And that's also another demonstration of strength. And I think that's why, and this is what we've subsequently seen, right? We're going to hurt ourselves we're going to hurt you even if we hurt ourselves. So global health, I think, was a lot. Is the initial targeting of global health explains a lot of what happened in the next 100 days. Now, what has been the impact? Well, materially, of course, we know that many people have died. I'm just going to read you some figures, not many. There's a website called pepfar.impactcounter.com, which uses a statistical model to estimate adult and child deaths since just for PEPFAR, which is the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief. This program, by the way, funded antiretroviral treatment for something like 25 million people. So 25 million people who take a pill every day that keeps them healthy had it withdrawn. So just think of the numbers. It's 3 times Switzerland. Those people won't die right away. It's not having your insulin withdrawn. If you stop insulin, you'll die in a week. In this case, you'll die in a number of years, but statistically speaking, some people will die earlier and others later. So we're talking about 44,819 deaths at this minute and 4,770 child deaths. So we're already up to Gaza-level figures of deaths. So the impact is real and ongoing. People are dying every minute because of these cuts. And there's been a material impact on infrastructure. So bills are going unpaid, computers have been taken away, drug stocks are being left to what do you call when they get périmés, to expire. So there's very real material consequences. What has this symbolic aspect done? Well, it's certainly done something very interesting, which is it's put the U.S. on the side of a broad, and particularly through the gender angle, of a broader illiberal diplomatic coalition. And there's this unlinking. I think it'll be interesting to see whether gender and global health diplomatically will become unlinked. Why? Because some of these illiberal countries, Russia, Hungary, and so on, are saying things about global health. So this will be very interesting to see how it plays out. There's a kind of a broad geopolitical realignment around gender and global health. An interesting and perhaps unexpected consequence is that a number of African intellectuals and activists have pointed out the paradox of their governments becoming dependent on a foreign government to maintain its large numbers of its citizens alive. Imagine that the U.S. was funding antiretroviral treatment for people with HIV in Geneva. Imagine if all of Geneva's sexual health services were funded by the U.S. That would be a bit odd, wouldn't it? We might wonder what the Confederation and the Canton are doing about that. So these kinds of questions are being raised very strongly by a number of people, some of whom we've actually invited to the World Health Assembly, to be a bit provocative. Another unexpected consequence, I would say, is the resurgence of health multilateralism. There's a sense that the rest of the world wants to show that it can progress and address global health issues without the U.S. And there's some evidence that things may even be easier without the U.S. The recent passage of the pandemic treaty has been cited by some. So the attempt to kill multilateralism seems to have backfired. And I can say as a Canadian that we're seeing this anti-Trump bump in elections in Australia and Canada and many other places here. So there's a kind of a paradoxical effect. This may not be working the way it was perhaps intended, although it's hard to see any intent. But finally, I think the most lasting impact at the level of populations has been a breakdown in trust, trust of the West, broadly understood. This started with COVID, as I mentioned when we met last time. With COVID, we saw how wealthy countries use their power and might to grab vaccines and personal protective equipment. Trust eroded further with the double standard that we saw in the wars of Ukraine and Gaza. One war was decried as a humanitarian outrage and one was not. And now we see it with the way the U.S. has effectively weaponized dependence on its aid to cause maximum harm. So this trust, like what we're hearing now, geopolitical trust, alliances, economics, will take several generations to rebuild. But the optimistic note, I think, is that we now, the U.S. has been using its soft power very deliberately, its money and influence to further its own ideological agendas around gender, for example. Some of us won't remember, I wasn't born yet or was barely born, that the U.S. was initially the instigator of family planning. The U.S. created the UNFPA, or its funding created the UNFPA. U.S. then withdraws under Reagan support for family planning, the gag order. It comes back in with Obama. It goes back out with Trump. And so we see that this very explicit use of economic power to further an ideological agenda, and maybe not having that power anymore will actually be will stabilize and allow more durable alliances to emerge. I'll stop there. Thank you.
So now we'd like to open to questions, both in the room and online. I've got an iPad in front of me, so if those of you who are joining us online would like to pose questions, please do put them there and I will see them. I would remind you, please, to introduce yourself and your affiliation when you take the mic. There will be mics passed around in the room. And please ask a question. So, does anybody want to take the first question in the room? Okay, so maybe I'll take the moderator's privilege and kick... Oh, there is one. Oh, perfect. There's two. Sorry, people didn't get their hands up. Oh, there's three. There's plenty. I didn't see the hands high enough. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for organizing this. Preeti from Geneva Health Files. You sort of alluded to it in the presentation you made. On how do you see this alliance of illiberal countries coming together? We expect to see some action at the WHA following up from last year's numerous votes on gender. Things are going to get much worse. What are the indications you're getting?
Potentially, yes, because those blocs are working and coordinating together. And those alliances are pretty strong, and the civil society that supports them is very strong in Geneva and working at the WHA behind the scenes. On the other hand, I think negotiating diplomats, the health attachés, need to also think about what matters in 2025 to get through. And I think this was a challenge last year at the WHO with gender responsiveness being contested for hours and hours of diplomatic time. And actually, from a technical perspective, and I'm going to put aside the politics for a moment, from a technical perspective, there are language that are agreed, and they may well be contested because it's stuff from the SDGs, but gender equality and so forth are terms that have credence, they have legitimacy, and they can get the work done. So the contestation over whether or not it's responsive, sensitive, and everything, it gets rather sort of bogged down with details that matter less in a technical standpoint. Whether or not countries wish, when they table their resolutions at this WHO, want to, in drafting their scripts, include gender and how they include it, we'll somewhat wait and see. But we know that many organisations, let's say, and some member states are engaging in what we described as anticipatory compliance, and that they are already walking away from or not including gender in their dialogues. So I would imagine, who knows, we'll wait and see, that there may actually be little contestation because gender may in fact be potentially not on the agenda in the same way one would hope it to be and expect it to be, which I think is worrying. It's complicit, I think, with the erasure, and it would be very challenging, very problematic, I would believe.
I have no idea. I think it'll be very interesting to watch, and what I would watch for is the unlinking of gender and global health, which have always been linked in the past. And I don't know what that would mean going forward either.
There was another question here.
Thank you for the great presentation. My question is more regarding the meetings that we're expecting here in Geneva. I would like to ask more if you have any insights on what to expect from the UNAIDS PCB meetings that are going to happen this year, especially after the main target that UNAIDS suffered from the Trump administration and other governments around the world, especially when Professor Nguyen mentioned the delinking between gender and global health, especially because UNAIDS has a mandate of very strongly connecting both of them for key populations and all of that. So if you have any insights on the UNAIDS role in that, in this scenario, thank you so much.
I don't have any specific insights. The conversations that I have been involved in, or eavesdropping on, maybe is a better way of putting it, is much more concerned about money and architecture. And I think that is really what's dominating the conversation. You know, who to merge with who, how many directors, what should be the salary of a W32, and, you know, what can we do with this board and this sub-department and this directorate. UNAIDS, there's been very far-fetched talk about, you know, closing UNAIDS, folding it into WHO, moving the whole thing to New York or Delhi or, you know, Kuala Lumpur. To me, it's all, how should I put it? It's there's a lot of smoke, you know, there's a lot of distraction, a lot of panic, and I think it's important to focus on what materially is going on in the field. I mean, that's my perspective. But.
Thank you. There was another hand. Here.
We have the lights.
Yeah, the lights are behind the people that are putting their hands up, so excuse me.
Hi, I'm Madeline. I'm now a fellow at GCSB. question for both of you, really. How come this has happened so quickly and there's been this almost total collapse of opposition to it? I mean, I know you've referenced it a little bit, but certainly on gender, the US pulled out of the Human Rights Council, and all of a sudden the Human Rights Council goes into reverse on everything we thought we'd established. Is it because people didn't believe it in the first place, that we didn't do our job enough in explaining it? What's your views? Thank you.
So this is personal opinion. It can't be Chatham House because it's being live streamed. But anyway, I'm trying to be faithful to sort of give a sense of where this opinion comes from. The blindsidedness of it, the being blindsided, raises really questions of governance, because it's not like this wasn't being signaled for the past 8 years. And in global health, there are people, including myself, who believe that this is a clear failure of governance. You should be able to anticipate this. Some governments anticipated things like tariffs and reacted in a certain, so I'm going to go back to my home country, Canada, had a plan. Tariffs were going to be announced. There was a plan. It was rolled out, et cetera, and dump the prime minister, get a new one, et cetera. The fact is that there does not seem to have been a plan, and there seems to have been panic is quite concerning. The other, I think the playbook here is, and as some of you have followed, I'm sure, Steve Bannon and what's called the alt-right, et cetera. This is a deliberate political strategy, actually charmingly out of Lenin, to seize power. It's a coup. And it's been so far appears to have been a very effective one in terms of seizing all the levers of government. And the same thing is being done to multilateral infrastructure. And I think Claire said something very important, this kind of anticipatory compliance, the anticipatory erasure of gender and global health. Let's just not talk about that. As you mentioned, the scrubbing of the mention from websites is, it's a little bit disturbing. Like, I don't know what are people afraid of? I mean, we're not in the U.S. You can't bundle us off to an El Salvadorian prison. You can just cut our funding. But a lot of these organizations are not that dependent on U.S. funding, or no, a lot of them are. But I think we've become, and this is the more controversial thing. I can't speak to gender, but in global health, enormous amounts of money are now channeled through Geneva into global health. Billions. I mean, a magnitude, several orders of magnitude over what was coming through here, 30, 40 years ago. So I think with money comes complacency.
Thanks. We haven't had that problem, money, unfortunately, in gender. We've never had funds. So I think what really worries me with that anticipatory compliance and on gender in particular, and this fear of including gender dimensions, gender perspectives, and this return to a binary, is that whilst it might start just with language, what it turns into then is work plans, strategies, budget lines, stuff that really, really count and really, really matter. And given how long, at least I've spent in gender and global health trying to get it on the global agenda, I find it hard to see how it will very easily come back on. And so I think that is something we need to be incredibly mindful of and start to address in the work that we're doing, and just not let it happen. And I don't know, I suppose maybe it's up for civil society and academics as well to be out there and standing strong on this, that we are not going to allow this sort of one country's decision and in its policies as you said, domestically initially, to impact the work we do in the rest of the world. So I think we need, to strengthen that civil society as well to be backing this all the way. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a question from our online audience. What are views regarding gender health future on the UNSG suggestions to fold UNFPA into UN Women?
There we go again. Who do we merge with who?
What's the question? What do we think of it?
Do you have views on it?
I think, UN Women hasn't been around all that long. I think we should keep it for a bit longer. I mean, it's like, and although, there are critiques, of course, that will always be critiques of different organisations, folding them into one another may not be a solution that it may just be a short-term financial solution that doesn't really advance the goals of all of the organisations in their particular mandates. And I think there are mandates that set these organisations up. They're set up to do particular things with particular strategies. So any folding over into or collapsing still has to maintain those key strategic endpoints.
So this is the kind of conversations that there are a lot of them. When it comes to tariffs, why don't we just merge Pepsi and Volvo and see how that works? I mean, I think when you look at the history of these organizations, and from memory, UNFPA, right? We're talking about UNFPA, was a vehicle for U.S. family planning policy. It was funded by the U.S. and at the time, women are vessels of procreation, right? So it was about dealing with all these brown and black uteruses floating around the world, having too many babies, and it was a clearly eugenicist project, and those of you who don't believe me can read Matthew Connolly's book, whose title I forget. It was Rockefeller, wasn't it? Or was it Ford? It was I think it was Rockefeller. So the history of these organizations is very important. UN Women comes at a very different time, completely different time, and reflects a very different culture, political culture. UNFPA is still much more, shall I dare say, technical, right? It's about delivering family planning. Think of truckloads of IUDs and contraceptive pills and colorful brochures. It's a logistics organization. UN Women is not. So that was where my remark comes about Pepsi and Volvo. They may look the same. They both manufacture things, but they were set up. They have very different histories and manufacture things that are used for very, very different things.
But actually, that question and your response prompts me to think about this, and response to that first question as well. Whilst we may see a decline in the use of the word gender, I think we're going to see a lot about women, but it's not all women, and that's what we need to completely understand, which was something that was often misunderstood in the Geneva Consensus Declaration. Fertile women, obviously, yes, and it's a certain type of reproducing body, and it's a protective agenda. It's one that uses the patriarchal power to put women into a particular place. And I think Judith Butler has written on this in quite extensively recently about how this is somewhat of a restorative ideology. It's an ideology that harks back to making things great again. It's going back to an illusionary past of particular gender norms and particular gender orders. So we're likely to see what looks like promotion of women and girls, but actually masks a very, very, or another gender justice, let's say, approach to the life of women and girls. Yeah.
Another question here.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you, Claire, you
may
mentioned...
you please sorry to interrupt you. May you please say who you are?
Oh, sure, sorry. Maria Luisa Bascour from UN Human Rights Office.
Thank you.
And I wanted to ask Claire, well, both of you actually, a question. You mentioned, Claire, the importance of the role of the family as a vector for all these changes, and we're seeing that sort of figure more prominently in the multilateral spaces. So I'd like to see, to hear from you what the trends you see, especially in terms of fertile women and motherhood, how you see those trends sort of manifesting themselves in these spaces. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's interesting that this has been happening for longer in the human rights space than it has been in the health space. And I think it was a shock to those working in global health that these were sort of Trojan horses for other agendas, that the promotion of women's health, hey, that's great, the promotion of the family and family health, great. But actually, what was underneath it was a much more complex ideology, an oppressive ideology that had already been popped up in the Human Rights Council, in other fora, in Geneva and in New York, in negotiations going back at least 10 years. So it becomes hugely problematic in the sense that it becomes a sort of false ideology, in the sense that it's easy to promote these things. It's easy to galvanize countries and blocs around the world, geopolitical alliances, around the concept of motherhood, nationalism, ways in which the mother, the elevation, in a sense, of the mother, reproducing mother role. And that feeds directly in. I mean, we've got centuries of literature that speak to this on the way in which that's been co-opted over time to extend the nationalism and the illiberal sort of countries, not democracy, illiberal countries that we see promoting this. So we see strange and interesting alliances that are popping up. They have been for quite some time. And again, I think sometimes the Universal Declaration doesn't help us here, because it states, and it gets recited by these groups, that the family is the fundamental unit of society, and it refers, and they interpret this to mean a particular type of nuclear family, a heteronormative family and gender order. So sometimes our own documents, I mean, the documents of the UN system are not always leveraging the sort of progress that others would like to have seen happening in these spaces. So it's definitely a trend. And I imagine in health, I think this is why it might not be delinked, is that the protection of women's health, the protection of the family are things that can be hijacked to galvanise particular member states and civil society, but also with a very hidden agenda that's not in any way progressive.
Are there any other questions in the room? Yes.
Thank you. Michelle Jarvis from UN IIIM, and really thanks a lot to both speakers for really clear presentations and very thought-provoking. Also to the Institute for carving out space for this discussion. The question I have actually, Claire, comes from your presentation. You mentioned this maybe being a transformative moment, and I think also alluded to the fact that there might be some lessons learned to take on board to help inform that. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about what should we be doing from this point.
Thank you for the very tough question. So for sure, I mean, we're at a point of this post-war era of a certain type of multilateralism has been, to some extent, functioning over nearly 80 years. And we look back historically, institutions do need to change and reform, and I don't think it's new to anybody within the UN or multilateral system that change is required, is needed, and so on. What I think is potentially transformational is that we have an opportunity right now to make sure that out of this disorder that's been created, we bake the cake, as it were, with the sorts of values that we want to continue into the next century, and that we do engage in reimagining what this multilateralism might look like. We might not even call it multilateralism. We might call it something completely different. But I think over time we know there are certain principles that we value, that worked, that have brought peace to parts of the world. Sometimes not always. Obviously, sometimes there's conflict, and it hasn't been so effective, and there's been lots of disasters that we can learn from. But I think the core principles of justice, of equity, of fairness, being kind to each other in the world, are the sorts of values that we want to bake into any system that we create into the future. And so I think we can, if we can look harder at what's gone wrong and where the geopolitical imbalances of the UN system when it was set up. I mean, the world has transformed completely in terms of decolonizing of Africa and Asia, and the proliferation of new countries who were never part of the establishment of the UN system in the first place. If we were to start again today, we would start very differently at a different point. We'd have 194 countries at least, plus some others as observers, involved in the creation of a new system, rather than the 40 or so that were there in the start of the UN system. So I think in that sense it is a transformation. It should be a transformational moment where we rethink those geopolitical alliances. And one of the critiques, of course, is that the UN system is baked with colonialism. And the idea is the political project of decolonizing in terms of knowledge, epistemologies, in terms of structures and power, really hasn't been that successful so far. We haven't upended things, we haven't reversed things. And so I think in that sense, this isn't the opportunity, this is the time to look at it, that those power imbalances that have for the last 80 years straddled the system. And actually that's, I think, particularly with gender, that's part of the frustrations also coming out, those geopolitical power imbalances. They came out during COVID, really exposing those fault lines of inequalities, the grab for vaccines and much of the world feeling that it was, not just feeling, it was left out. The hoarding of vaccines, of international property rights, the right to development. These are all interconnected issues with global health and gender. And I think in terms of rethinking that system, this is a critical moment where we should be doing it. And it's probably up to some smart academics somewhere to restart, and civil society and states that are interested in doing something to come together and to reimagine what could be. And it's got to be a different power relationship for sure. I mean, that's the most fundamental element of any change or transformation in the system. The power dynamics need to be upended.
Thank you. Is there another question in the room? I have a question, if I'm allowed. Both of you have alluded to infrastructures. We've got 3 minutes till we close, so please, brief answers. But both of you have alluded to infrastructures. So when you think about either the gender world or the global health world or the interconnected worlds between them, which key infrastructures do you think are most at risk and you're most concerned about needing to coalesce the type of support you just talked about, Claire, around those areas to save them?
Which infrastructures are most at risk? I'd put it, the infrastructures that I think would need most emboldening and funding is probably civil society. From a feminist perspective, it's really about grassroots activism and mobilising from that space of the margins. So maybe not, I've reversed your question, but infrastructures that need to be kept, that's a really difficult question. I'm not quite sure. I mean, some kind of dialogue between countries, between what is our current notion of the nation state, if that even will continue to exist in its same shape and form. So dialogues between bounded entities or political systems need to continue.
So I would say something very similar, and I would take infrastructure as a term that refers to the invisible infrastructure that allows things to happen, and that's trust. And trust between countries, trust between citizens and their governments, and trust between people and other countries. That's fundamental, and that's what's been most under attack. The other infrastructure that I realized listening to you, Claire, is that of language. Of having a mechanism to, language anchors all kinds of things in documents, but then in the real world. And we've worked very hard, not me personally, but the international community over the last 70 years to develop common language around things. It's not unlike what we've done in science, common understanding of things. And so this is also under attack through the attack on science and disinformation and so on. So I think trust and sort of common language would be the two infrastructures most at risk.
Thank you both very much. So I'd like to thank both our speakers for their insightful commentary, remarks, and help to all of us in understanding the disorder that we are experiencing in Geneva and beyond. And I'd like to thank all of you in the room and online for joining us today. Thank you so much.